Hi guys, this is a restream from CarrieJ in PA. I'm going to put all of her information down below so that way you can follow, subscribe, and like her channel. It was just way too good not to go ahead and replay it. And why reinvent the wheel? This is an excellent video, folks. As soon as I find it, there we go. Okay, we're off.
Hi everybody, it's CarrieJ. I am back with another video, and today we are going to be talking about something very serious, and just warning, trigger warning, and also content warning. We are going to be talking about child abuse investigations generally, and also getting input from what I consider to be an expert in child abuse investigations. My friend Heather is going to join us to talk about some of the practices in Scientology and whether or not they might rise to the legal definition of child abuse. If you don't know who I am CarrieJ. I'm a lawyer licensed in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. And my practice, I've practiced for over 20 years, has been mostly criminal and in the last 11 years, child welfare. So I am an anti-Scientology protester. I am part of the anti-Scientology online movement, and this video will be viewed, presented with the view towards Scientology. But if you found this video just because you're interested in how these things work, we will be talking generally about child abuse investigations, and it would be the same process no matter what the allegation of abuse is or who the alleged perpetrator of that abuse might be. So please stick around. So without further ado, I would like to bring forward my friend Heather to the stage. Hey, Heather.
Hi.
Thank you so much for doing this. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
And we both have dogs, FYI, so we're trying to keep them quiet. So if you hear little whines or barks in the background, we have our companions with us. So, Heather, I don't want to speak for you. Why don't you tell us a little bit about your background and your work in investigating child abuse?
So, my background, I've worked in different settings with children throughout my career in social work. I worked in the intake unit for Children and Youth Services in Western PA. I started working with children in a homeless shelter in California, and it's grown since then with social work. I've worked both with domestic violence victims. I've worked with drug and alcohol, mental health, and I worked for the intake unit for Children and Youth Services in Western PA. And my role was investigating child abuse.
Okay. And just by way of further explanation of your background, you're originally from Southern California, is that right?
Yes, I am.
And somehow you found yourself in cloudy Western PA.
Yes.
For which I am glad, but I'm sure it was a bit of a culture shock. And your background, I think you've told me before, working with in the homeless shelter, it was specifically for homeless veterans.
Yes.
Okay. And that must have incorporated a lot of mental health, substance abuse disorders, and things like that.
Yes, correct.
Okay. Okay. So, yeah. And then you and I was the attorney at the agency when you were in the intake unit. And why don't you describe for the viewers just a little bit about what an intake unit at a county children youth agency does?
So we get referrals through Childline, and that's an international, it's for the state of PA, it's where you would call or go online and report child abuse or neglect or anything constituting as concerns with children. So we would get the referrals, and at that point I would start the investigation and look into what the referrer was stating and investigate all that went with the concerns or the child abuse allegations.
Okay, so Childline is by way of further explanation, the state child abuse registry. So Childline is the place to make referrals for if you suspect a child is being abused or neglected, or, just there's some sort of need for intervention by the authorities, whether police or children and youth. And then it also maintains the list of people who have been found to be child abusers. So this is like teachers and school bus drivers and people who work in nursery schools, daycares, even church, Sunday schools. When they talk about getting their clearances, they have to get a report from Pennsylvania's Childline that says they have no indications of having committed child abuse. Okay, so let's say a referral comes in for child abuse, and it would be assigned to one of several people in the intake unit. Take us through that process. Let's say it's one of the more serious ones. Let's say it's child SA, and we use SA for, we don't say the words because I don't think YouTube likes it. So let's say a referral comes in for child SA. Is there a specific amount of time that you have to get started on your investigation?
Yes, for anything to do with child abuse or neglect, it's within 24 hours. Typically, you go out the first hour of getting the report to ensure the safety and at that moment of the child.
Okay, and I think I've heard this before. We have to be in the law very careful about how we investigate when it's us communicating with the child, preserving the what's the word I'm looking for? The integrity of the report,
yes,
if any, that comes out of the child's mouth. Yes. So I think you guys do something called a bare facts interview. Is that right?
Yes.
Or minimal facts interview.
Minimal facts. So depending on the time of the referral and that I get the referral, in cases like that, I try to see the child if they're in school, if it's possible. Why
is that?
Because they're in a safe place and I'm able to talk to the child alone. Okay. That is not, if the allegations are correct, and if the perpetrator is in the home, it gives the child space to maybe speak freely in the home they're not able to.
Okay.
So that's the goal. If not, then we do go to the home. All referrals, whoever the mandated reporter, whoever makes a report is anonymous. So when I do the bare facts, I do very minimal when I do come in the home to talk to the child. And it's just to get, just to kind of observe the child, talk to them bare minimally, but to assess the safety when I go into that home.
So you're kind of trying to get a sense of whether there is something to the report that's come in?
Yes.
Okay. And under Pennsylvania law, and I would imagine most states with, mandated reporters or other types of developed laws on how to report child abuse. In Pennsylvania, any referral source, so the person who calls in, they are statutory confidential. So they can be anonymous or they can give their name and say, hey, I'm, the babysitter and I'm seeing bruises. But their name, their identity, all of that stuff is by law confidential. And that is a no-go. So we do everything we can in the nature of our investigation not to make it known through the circumstances, like what we're saying, oh, hey, yeah, we heard this, to reveal the identity of the person who gave us that. Be like, oh, yeah, we hear that, every Monday when he comes home from dad's house to your house, he has bruises. So it would be like, okay, well, we know that that's probably mom making that referral. So we try to be very careful in how we speak. So you've done the minimal facts, you've observed the child in the home, your antenna are buzzing a little bit, and you're like, yeah, I think we should move forward with the next step. What is the next step?
Well, the next step is to determine the safety at that moment with the child, and that's all going to be based off of the age and what's appropriate. If a child, if it's a baby or a toddler or non-speaking, or a child that is not able to speak or speak for themselves, then action needs to be taken immediately, depending on the facts. So a lot of times what we would do is we would request a forensic interview. And that's for a child, and depending on the age, it might be a forensic interview, a physical forensic interview to determine with SA. Now, if the child's older, I will ask to meet with the child alone while I'm doing that bare minimum facts to just kind of gauge where the child's at with the questions. A lot of it is just listening to the child. And I think that's a important, it's a lot is said through physical and listening. When you're
What do you mean by that? A lot is said. Do you mean by body language, demeanor?
By body language. When I'm asking a child a question, if they're able to make eye contact, if they might be looking at adult for assistance with answering the questions.
Those are red flags.
Those are red flags.
Seeking approval before you speak, kind of thing.
Yes.
Okay.
And so I would look at the body language of the child and how the child's answering a question. Depending on the question you're answering, and when you're talking to children, it is hard for children to be scripted. They're not experts at it typically. So when questions, one of the big red flags is questions, children are using words they wouldn't use. I've seen that a lot. Okay. So it's just listening to the child, how they're answering a question based off of their age and just their body language.
And when you're mentioning that you're looking to see if they're using words that they wouldn't otherwise have a reason to know, is it because you're looking for someone maybe having suggested that word to them or coached them on using that word, and that's how you can kind of filter out maybe this referral is not true?
Yes, coaching is it's definitely something you could see. The second tool that we use is forensic interviews, but it's verbal forensic interviews where they are interviewed by a specialist based off of the referral and the allegations.
And just to, because a lot of people, if they're coming to this video from the anti-Scientology space, they probably really don't know a lot about how child abuse investigations work. A forensic interview is where it's a very neutral setting. There's the interview of the child is conducted by someone trained for this specific purpose to allow the child to reveal make statements and reveal in their own words what has happened to them. And they're very careful, and this is why they need special training, to not suggest anything. So there's no leading questions like, well, where did he touch you? They just let them talk. And then there's video cameras, and it's recorded and audio recorded. And then it's also being broadcast simultaneously while it's being recorded to a room where investigators like you or maybe a police detective are listening and watching. And then, maybe you guys have some questions you want the forensic examiner to put to the child. And she checks in with you and like, okay, I'm coming back. I'm going to ask some more questions and, things like that. And then that is the record of the child's statement. And that should be the only record of the child's statement. Multiple questioning of a child SA victim is considered inherently suggestive. So back in the day, they'd be like, okay, you have to, the child's going to be interviewed by mom and then dad and then grandma and then a teacher and then a police officer and then the prosecutor and then all these different people. And they found that is a not reliable way to elicit accounts from children for what has happened to them. So they do this and they make the forensic examination. They make one record. It's recorded. That's what would be introduced if needed. in court. And that's the only questioning that that child should go through. So, okay, so let's say you in your investigation, there's been a forensic, the child has made disclosures that indicate child SA has happened to that child. What do you do next?
Then we interview with the police. So the police get a report as well as Children and Youth Services. So we work hand in hand with the police, and based off of their direction, we will interview the alleged perpetrator.
Okay. You're required by the Child Protective Services law in Pennsylvania to give the alleged perpetrator that interview option. They don't have to take it, but you're required to offer it. Is that right?
Required to offer it, yes.
Okay.
And so based off of there, we would make a safety plan. So depending on who the alleged perpetrator is, if the perpetrator is in the home, we need to look at options to get the child out of the home, whether it's kinship, which is family or friends, or foster. Now, in some cases, it just depends on every situation's a little different based off the age, the child, and who they're living with. A lot of times you could work with a parent who will take action on their own, and they might place a PFA on the perpetrator and keep the child away from the perpetrator, but that's not always the case.
Yes, sadly, we've seen that. Yeah. And I'm sorry, go ahead.
Those are the cases. Typically, there's a lot of times with the SA, it might be a parent's paramour. And we see that they don't want to leave the paramour.
Right.
And in that case is when we would request an ex parte for the child, where Children and Youth Services would take legal and physical custody of the child to ensure their safety.
Yeah. And that's, I did a video a few weeks ago talking about when a perpetrator and a victim are one and the same. And I gave the example that we would see a lot where, mom's new boyfriend is abusing her children and she knows about it and doesn't do anything. So she's a perpetrator by omission because she has a legal responsibility to protect her children from abuse, and she's not doing that. So she herself, even though she didn't hit them or do anything to them, she herself is a perpetrator by omission. But she may also be a domestic violence victim. And she didn't take the steps to protect her kids, because if she did, boyfriend would beat the crap out of her. So it can get a little, But so you only are removing children from the home if there is no safe caregiver in that home. Like,
yes,
if mom's kind of taking the side of boyfriend, like, oh, he would never do that, she's lying. Then you're like, well, she's not safe with you then. We need you to understand that your child has to be protected. There's indications that that's necessary and you need to do it. And if you don't, we're going to do it for you. Okay.
And those cases are very difficult because, like you said, the perpetrator is also a victim. But Children and Youth Services is there for the child's safety. Right. But they do assist the family in getting services that are needed as well if they're willing.
Yeah.
So that's one thing that we do look at and attempt to try to get services placed so the family could work together and
come back together.
Yes.
Without the abuser, maybe.
Without the perpetrator.
Yeah. And CYS, Children and Youth Services, it blends this kind of civil child abuse investigation for the purpose of the registry that we need to maintain. But then also you're kind of mentioning like getting into dependency, where the child's removed, a court case is started, and there are all sorts of things that the court orders and that the laws require. And that's to kind of deal with the aftermath of this event having happened in this family. So, and then you mentioned you have so many friends.
I have so many in my house.
You have so many friends. So, and just to kind of wrap up this general kind of discussion. So, the forensics done, you have to make a report back to the state database, Childline.
Mhm.
And what are the 3 options that you have?
So if there is not enough information or through the investigation, we did not find the allegations to be true, it would be unfounded.
Okay.
The second one, if we do find that the forensic or the allegations were correct, would be founded. And the third would be if there is a criminal charge and they're found guilty, then they would be indicated.
No, that's swapped. Indicated is when.
No, you're right. Okay.
Yeah, indicated is when there's.
You're gonna have to edit this because you're right.
I'm making this in. You're laughing and everything. So indicated is when
we found the allegation.
You think there's enough there. You think it's accurate. You think it's a correct report. It's true, but you don't have that criminal conviction or court determination that abuse happened and the person's the perpetrator of it.
Yes, and then at that point it would be founded.
Okay. Okay. All right. So, all right, I did that one generally. Okay. So, before we get into the kind of the Scientology side of this discussion, the example we just worked through was a very obvious, easily understandable example of child abuse where there's probably physical indications, maybe bruising in a certain area of the body. What about when you get referrals for alleged child abuse that are kind of less obvious, more emotional abuse, verbal abuse? Can you talk a little bit about what you're looking for when you investigate those types of allegations?
So it's with emotional and verbal, like you mentioned, we don't see anything. There's no physical. So it's definitely, once again, meeting with a child and looking at body language, the way they answer questions, and listening to the child. Also, in those cases, a lot of times with emotional and verbal abuse, it's somebody that has direct contact to the child on a regular basis. So we're looking at the people who are part of this child lives, and it's oftentimes a parent, a paramour, or a relative that sees the child on a regular basis. So a lot of the investigation is around them as well, and how they answer questions, and their willingness with the investigation.
Okay.
A lot of times when there's emotional and verbal abuse of a child, the perpetrator will not want us to have access to even talk to the child. And those cases is you have to look at all of the elements together. And once again, it's how that child's answering that. And the question, what's the child day looks like, what their life looks like, what their home looks like. A lot of with emotional and verbal abuse is isolation. Is one of the factors that we look at. A child's not able to speak for themselves. So there's control. There's them, once again, looking to the perpetrator to answer the question for them. So they're dismissive more of the time.
Okay.
So we're looking at all the factors, but emotional and verbal abuse, it is harder because we don't have the physical element. So it's really listening to the child, and in a lot of those cases is getting the child into services like counseling, therapy, play therapy, where it's able to come out with a professional.
And just to round out this discussion, even if a situation like that where you maybe don't have the evidence you need to prove to whoever needs to know that child abuse happened, whether it's court, whether it's the burden of proof you need to submit Childline, you can still set up services through what's called a general protective services case, which is the child is not removed from the home. the legal and physical custody of the child is not interfered with by the government at all. But there's a caseworker checking up on things, making suggestions to the family. Hey, we think you guys should engage in family therapy, or we think you guys should do this. And then sometimes the family's refusal to kind of go into and participate in those services is itself a red flag. And that tends to happen a lot. Like you said, like they know if they allow professionals access to the child might start talking, and the child might reveal everything that's been going on in the home. So they lose control over the child if they start engaging in services. So sometimes that refusal to engage in services is a red flag, because we think they might be trying to keep the child from disclosing. So just wanted to mention that.
In those, it is definitely harder with emotional verbal abuse. But by having that GPS, is what it's General Protective Service, in place and following up, we could continue checking on the child. But a lot of times is looking at what the child's involved in, talking to the teachers, talking to the school, getting the school's reaction. A lot of times based off the age of the child, how they're talking to their peers, you could see what they feel that it might be appropriate is not appropriate to others. And this is the language. Depending on the child's age, they mimic their parents and how their parents talk to them.
Yeah.
And so by having those conversations and following up with school, if they are in fact schooled and not homeschooled, or even following up on with their medical as well. With younger children, with verbal emotional abuse, their PCP might have referred them to early intervention based off of the child maybe being non-speaking or having needing speech therapy, and then just confirming if the parents followed up with those services. Because emotional verbal abuse, even though it doesn't leave the physical scars, there is still physical attributes to it.
Yeah.
It still affects the child physically in some aspects.
You're kind of leaning into actually trauma, and how we're just starting to scratch the surface to understand what trauma does physically to whether it's children or adults. No matter what the source of the trauma is. And there's that book, and I just want to mention it. It was The Body Tells the Story, I think is the title, that talks about how our bodies absorb and respond to trauma, even if the trauma being inflicted on us is not physical trauma, like broken bones and bruises or SA. The body kind of absorbs that, and yeah, it's fascinating what we're just starting to learn about. So
it is. It's definitely interesting, just how much it could impact, and developmentally you want to look at it as well. Oftentimes, abusers that emotionally abuse and verbally abuse they see the child as negative, and they're not able to hide that often. So a lot of times if you dig deeper, they might say the child has behavior issues, or the child has developmental issues, and this is why there's a reaction this way. So in that cases, I always look, okay, what is the treatment of the child? What resources and services are they using? And in a lot of cases with emotional and verbal abuse, I'm able to work with the family on getting the child evaluated. And oftentimes through evaluation, based off of that, we are able to get information and a professional stating that there's emotional abuse within the home.
Okay. Well, let's switch gears, if that's okay, to talking about a couple practices that are current in Scientology. And to those of you who are watching who have come from the anti-Scientology movement, I'm not going to be asking her about the cadet org and the ranches because supposedly those things don't exist anymore. And they're pretty clearly abusive. I want to talk about like actual practices that form part of the religion. That is not, in my opinion, a religion, that form part of the religion and religious practice of Scientology, and specifically talking about auditing, either auditing children or training children to be auditors, and bull baiting. And I had you watch a video where Aaron Smith-Levin and Serge Delmar talked about it, and I'm going to see if I can just play a little bit from it. And the link to the video will be in the description here. Hang on, let me see if I can figure this out. 1 second. Okay. All right. There we go. Okay. Let me just play some of this, and then I'd love to hear your take on it as a child abuse investigator, if you had received information like what we're about to hear, what you would think of it and what you might do about it. So let me go ahead and play it.
But like, this is the shit that my mother was doing when he was 14, and doing these drills. He was twinned up with Jill Saferstein. And Jill Saferstein was one of those sick fucking perverts who took so much pleasure in going through these drills with Colin in the most disgusting and perverted way possible. And then the Scientologist, everyone justifies it as like, oh, well, that's just high confront. You're just training people to have high confront and to have good bull bait and all this kind of shit. So like, step 2, once you have your list of the most disgusting, sexually inappropriate subjects you can possibly imagine, which let's just for the sake of the example, use something relatively, comparatively innocuous as just the word fucking, okay?
Yeah.
But let's say you're doing this on a child. Step 2 says an item from the list is included in the audited command. What would you be willing to tell me about blank? Okay, so again, imagine you're either the child receiving the auditing or you're the child giving the auditing. And the question that's going to be repeated dozens or hundreds of times is, what would you be willing to tell me about fucking? And that's probably the easiest word that we could use.
Okay. So that's just a little snippet. What do you think of what you heard there?
It's disheartening. It's harmful.
It's harmful.
It's very harmful.
Yeah. As a child abuse investigator, if you got a referral that a child is either being forced to over and over say, what can you tell me about fucking? What can you tell me about fucking? And I think in that video, he goes on to say, you wouldn't say oral sex, you would say sucking cock. Like the language that they're using is not, is very vulgar language. Like, would you think, hey, there's something here to investigate?
When adults use adult language with children, the things that come to mind is grooming.
Okay.
Oftentimes with SA perpetrators and grooming, they treat a child like an adult. And they use that language with a child to groom them in a certain way so they feel confident and on the same level as the perpetrator.
And we, in a non-Scientology setting, we I think know this most recognizably when an older man is grooming a younger girl and saying, "Oh, you're so mature for your age. Yeah, you might be 14, but you're such an old soul. You're so far ahead of your peers." Like that's mm-hmm. kind of the non-Scientology instance that is commonly discussed. I think that's a fascinating point. And I think you watched Going Clear recently also ahead of doing this video. Are you aware that in Scientology, they don't believe in children? children are not children. Children are adults in small bodies. How does that factor in, if at all?
By not acknowledging a child, children's, based off of their age, physically, their brain, and their development and their growth, by dismissing that a child is a child, once again, is a grooming technique. It's a technique to use to show that the child's on the same level, so they could treat the child any way they want to treat the child, that they don't have to show, what is the word I'm looking for? They don't have to look at the innocence of a child. So they don't factor in the impact they're making on a child. So it puts them on the same level, that same playing field, which is, it's complete red flags. It's complete concerns, regardless of beliefs, physically, mentally, emotionally, and legally. There is a definition of what a child is. Regardless of what your belief is, it doesn't change the fact that a child is a child, and they do not have the capability or the capacity to have consent.
What about the language and itself? Not just that it's grooming them, maybe getting them ready to be treated in an abusive way further down the line, but going through that and either being asked multiple times or doing the asking, is that process itself abusive to you?
Yes.
Okay.
It's the process itself, asking a child questions that are inappropriate and questions based off of things that they should not know.
Okay.
A child does not, depending on the age of a child, should not know what those terms mean.
Okay. And then before we look at another clip on bull baiting, I just want to follow that a little bit. Children being forced to talk about things that they should not know about, adult topics with adult verbiage that they shouldn't be aware of. What are some of the risks for children if that happens to them?
The risks for the child is there's multiple. There's PTSD, developmental risks. You could go down a list of what specifically how that impacts a child.
Well, I did make a little list. Do you want me to pull that up?
Yes, pull
because
up.
I think I showed it to you. Now might be a good time. Second. Let me stop sharing that. Let's see if I have it. No, I don't. Cancel. Okay. Let's see if I can figure out how to do this. Oh, you're being invaded. The dogs have come.
Yes, I am sorry about my zoo.
It's okay. It's blocking it.
I have the list and
and maybe I'll figure out a way to add this in the edits. But so these are just like, I made a list and I had you, let me know what you thought of it, of things that we've come across as consequences for child abuse and neglect. And let's just keep it on the topic of these auditing questions, either being asked or forced to ask them. The one that really that makes me think of is the lack of boundaries. I represented as a guardian ad litem, so I was the attorney appointed to represent the legal best interest of a child. And she had been SA'd. But one of the consequences for her was that she had no boundaries with social settings. So everybody was her BFF. You know, when somebody, she was in a secondary school. And so when a classmate that she's known for a week went back to the mainstream school, like she's crying her eyes out, even though she's known this person for a week. And then she doesn't have the boundaries to keep herself safe from predators. So she was I had to talk to her about this. She was at like a McDonald's or something, and an older man started chatting her up, and she just gave him her cell phone number. And I'd be like, no, honey, don't do that. And then online predators, people were, you know, starting to engage her in inappropriate online chats that they should be arrested for. But there was just no sense of boundaries to keep herself safe from others. Does that sound like something wise?
Oftentimes you see a lack of boundaries with children, and that goes hand in hand. And then on the other side of it, though, you see the parentification. I see that so often, and that's often when you look at children that with neglect, often cases is parentification. And in these cases, in these practices, by asking a child to ask these questions, you're putting them in adult role.
Yes.
So they start to believe that they are an adult, and they take on the adult world, and they lose that sense of being a child.
And parentification, I can't remember if it's in the DSM or not, but parentification, like you said, we see it where like mom and dad have a substance abuse disorder. So the oldest sibling takes charge of taking care of the younger kids, making dinner, making sure they get baths, etc. But this idea of switching the role of adult and child, even in a non-domestic setting, the consequences of parentification can go up to, it's just about everything under the sun in terms of anxiety, etc. But it can go up to and include substance abuse disorders being developed and unaliving, you know, at the most serious. So parentification is a very significant consequence, I think.
You also see a lot of, I see with children, a lot of self-harm. They're put in these roles that they don't want to be in, and they don't have control.
They're talking about petting, like,
yes.
Yeah.
Often you will see child when they feel like they do not have control as a way of controlling the situation. So you often see that as well in cases like this. But yeah, there's so much with this and putting a child in this role. PTSD, we talked about PTSI, anxiety, depression, lack of boundaries. Also, it could isolate a child later in their lives too. And not want those connections with others. It could completely isolate them where they don't have those supports, and they don't seek supports anymore. They internalize everything.
Yeah. Let me see one other thing before we go on to the other clip I wanted to show you. So I pulled Florida's definition of child abuse and California's, because here in Pennsylvania, we have a very robust, developed child abuse definition, child protective services law, but it came at the expense of a lot of kids whose cases fell through the cracks, and that was highlighted by the infamous Jerry Sandusky situation. In the wake of Jerry Sandusky, that scandal, Pennsylvania basically revamped its child protective services law and really kind of beefed things up. But not every state has that well-developed, laid out, clear definition like we've been using since 2014. So let me just pull up some of these. Share screen. Let's see, which one is this? Okay, so here's the Florida statute. And I don't know if people can read this. It's probably very small, but this is the website Oh, wait, I didn't share it. Hang on. I always forget this part. Add to stage. Okay. So you can see it's kind of small. I don't know if I can, which one is it? This one? This one. I don't think I can zoom in, but it gives, here's the statute for it. And you can go and look at it yourself. And here, down here in 827.03 subparagraph 1B gives definition of child abuse. And it's really kind of simple. I mean, it's 1, 2, 3, that's it. Intentional infliction of physical or mental injury upon a child, an intentional act that could reasonably be expected to result in physical or mental injury to a child, or active encouragement of any person to commit an act that results or could reasonably be expected to result in physical or mental injury to a child. So it's whether, if you do it, if you try to do it, and if you encourage someone else, but it basically comes down to physical or mental injury upon a child. That's like the whole definition, which as a lawyer, I don't like that. I'd have to dive into Florida case law, judicial decisions to see how the courts in Florida, interpret that. But in light of that Florida definition and what we heard described as with the auditing, do you feel that might fall into a mental injury?
Yes.
Yeah.
I would. The practice itself is abusive.
Yeah.
Maybe not physically, but by putting the children in these roles. So you could argue the third point that potentially it's going to harm the child rather, and I can't see exactly. Potentially it's going to cause harm for the child.
Yeah.
And I think any clinical psychologist would look at those practices as a form of emotional abuse by putting the child in that role. So by putting them in the role outside of what's their capacity and their consent automatically would cause harm to the child.
Oh, all right. Let me also pull up. Let's see. It might be easiest if let me just show 2 statutes from California so people can go and read them themselves if they're interested. And then there's actually a nice little, here we go. Here, this one. Okay, so here is, again, it's going to be hard to see, but I wanted people to see that I'm pulling this from these statutes, and they can at least see the part in bold and maybe Google it themselves if they want to read the text. This is where you would find it. So this is in the child welfare, kind of like what we did, the dependency side, the civil side of child abuse. And let me just scroll down. And you can see that it is kind of like their whole CPS, Child Protective Services law, is in here, kind of mixed in with the Juvenile Act for like that we would understand it. So this is, where is the part that is, this is like the basis of dependency. So I'm not sure if they have their definition in here. But this comes from so it's the Welfare and Institutions Code within the California statute, which is called a code. Division 2, Part 1, Chapter 2, Article 6, dependent children, if anybody wants to look at it that. And then let me show one more. they also have a penal one that I want to show. Present, share screen. Okay. And then add to stage. Here's another. So this is in the penal, the criminal code, essentially. So it's Part 4, Title 1, Chapter 2, Article 2.5, Child Abuse and Neglect Reporting Act. So this is kind of like what you were talking about. Here's where we get that definition of abuse. The willful harming or injury of a child. I'm down at 11165.3. As used in this article, quote, the willful harming or injuring of a child or the endangering of the person or health of a child means a situation in which any person willfully causes or permits any child to suffer or inflicts thereon unjustifiable physical pain or mental suffering, or having the care of the child willfully causes or permits the person or health of the child to be placed in a situation in which his or her person or health is endangered. So it kind of is similar to Florida's, the whole physical pain or mental suffering. Florida and California seem to kind of mimic that. And in your work in California, did you, this was maybe too long ago. I don't know how long ago it was that you were there. Did you encounter instances of child abuse that you needed to take action on?
So it's been 7 years since I've been in California, but working in the shelter, we did have families, we had children. And one of the main things that I saw that I did have to take action on was neglect. Mm-hmm. Oftentimes, a mother leaving a child with somebody they just met off the street.
Okay.
Or leaving a child unattended.
Excuse me for interrupting, but let me just kind of bring this full circle with California's law. If what we saw described in Aaron and Serge's video fit the Florida definition of mental injury to a child, I would assume, please correct me if I'm wrong, that in your opinion, it fits the legal definition of child abuse in California also. Is that
correct?
Right?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. All right. Let me move on to this last clip where they're talking about bull baiting. Did you get information from the Going Clear? It's been so long since I watched Going Clear.
It does talk about bull baiting.
But not with children. They are not talking
with children. They didn't really express much with children in that documentary, besides the not bonding.
Let me just kind of close out. Okay. Oops. All right. Let me present this tab. Okay. And let me silence my phone. I've pulled these videos from Aaron Smith Levin's channel, and Heather, you probably will have no idea what I'm talking about when I say this, but for anyone who wants to come at me in the comments that I'm only showing Aaron Smith Levin videos, what I'm doing here with Heather, this video, this is about getting the facts and the information. This is not about Aaron versus Nora. This is not about SPTV versus Aftermath Foundation. This is just where I remembered hearing these descriptions. And it just so happened that I remembered hearing them on Aaron's channel. And the fact that I remembered them at all is a miracle, because a lot of times I walk into a room and I forget why I'm in there. So I just happened to remember, among the hundreds and hundreds, maybe thousands of anti-Scientology videos out there, I just happen to remember, I heard it in this one. So don't come at me, y'all. All right. So, okay. So let me hit play on this. And this is them talking about bull baiting. And they're not talking about it in the context of children, but later on in this video, that is up, and the link will be in the description. Aaron Smith-Levin clarifies that children would have gone through these bull baiting training routines. So he's kind of describing them here. I don't think I showed this one to you before. So let me hit play.
You've ever heard described as Scientology's TRs from 0 to 4 it is on that course. It's just done at a lower gradient of toughness. And so, yeah, you could walk into an introductory course room and somebody could be doing bull baiting, where one person is sitting there in a chair and their coach is, one person sitting there in a chair, hands on the knees, sitting straight up and not moving or clicking or anything. And the coach is doing or saying things. You're not supposed to physically touch the person. Sometimes you do. You're not supposed to be inappropriate with them physically. You're supposed to yell. You're supposed to call them names. You're supposed to push their buttons. You're supposed to make fun of them. And even as a course supervisor, I was always incredibly uncomfortable with any bull baiting being done around brand new people, because you're like, how do we explain? Like, if you have to explain why we're doing it, yes, it can be explained. But it's like, it's one of those weird things where when you're in your own bubble, you're like, yes, totally normal. And then,
all right, let me see. There's another part. Let me get the transcript where he's talking about, oh, here we go. Let me get, okay, here, this part.
the org, we've got David Santiago, who's a staff member who always comes up to bull bait. He takes off his tie, he wraps it around his head like Rambo, and he rolls up his arms, and he pretends to be going down on the woman that he's bull baiting. And could you imagine someone walks by the course and giving a tour, and they're like, what in the hell is going on in there? I thought this was a church, ma'am.
Okay, so obviously, let me take that down. So the idea of simulated cunnilingus, to use proper terminology, pretending to perform oral sex on someone during a bull baiting session happens. That's something that we could all pretty readily understand to be child abuse if the person receiving that behavior is a minor. But what about what he said about, pushing their buttons, trying to make them upset, being vile and disgusting and mean and calling them names? In light of the statutes that we just looked at, does that practice sound like it might fit the legal definition of child abuse to you?
Yes. The fact that they're willingly causing harm to the child, because at that moment, when you're putting a child into distress, it's putting them at harm. And
I think that's really important. Can you say that again? Because I'm taking notes while you talk.
By willingly putting a child into distress, they're doing harm.
By willingly putting them into emotional distress.
Emotional distress. They're causing anxiety. They're causing fear. They're emotionally abusing the child in that moment.
Does that meet the same, is that the same as saying that's a mental injury, or is that maybe part of what might be used to determine a mental injury?
I think that would be part of determining a mental injury, but it really depends on what exactly is being said. In each case, you could argue that, because there's going to be an aftermath to this, putting a child in distress like this. There's going to be emotional, developmental, physical.
Okay.
And we talked about those before, like the self-harm, the anxiety, the depression.
Yeah, obsessive compulsive disorder, reactive attachment disorder. And I'll do another video where we kind of go through that, and I'm going to kind of take what you're saying today and be the lawyer with it and say, how would I prove that what this bull baiting and these auditing things are themselves child abuse under the legal definition? So, but yeah, there's so many ways kids can be hurt by this. And one thing my husband had me add, because he and I met when he was a caseworker at Children and Youth, was poor academic performance and development, and poor hygiene, and increased hyperactivity due to poor diet. So that would be more like in the neglect category, which definitely comes into play. Like, we've been specific with bull baiting and auditing, but neglect of children, and I haven't really gone into this with you, but they basically leave kids to fend for themselves, and they bring them on staff to work in their facilities at like age 12, and they work them 12-hour days. So there's labor trafficking implications, as well as they're hardly given any time to tend to their own needs, including hygienic needs and nutritional needs. So in any event, I just wanted to throw that in there. So, okay. Let me check my list. Anything else you want to add on that topic of bull baiting with the mental injury, the emotional distress that you noted?
I feel like it's a very harmful practice, and regardless with any child, because of their capacity and not able to give consent, it's going to do harm.
I agree with you, Heather. I agree with that opinion. Mandatory disclosure, disclaimer. Even though I'm an attorney, none of what we've talked about here today can constitute legal advice. I am not qualified to give legal advice anywhere outside of Pennsylvania. And if somebody does require legal advice on these types of matters, please go to your county courthouse, ask for the lawyer referral service. Most courthouses and court systems in the country have some type of lawyer referral service run through the professional organization of lawyers, often called the Bar Association, and reach out to an attorney licensed and knowledgeable in your jurisdiction. But I just wanted to kind of get your take, Heather, as you're you're not an anti-Scientology protester. You don't create content on YouTube for that purpose. But I have always found you to be an extremely thorough, knowledgeable, well-prepared caseworker. I knew when I had a court case and you were involved, I knew that you had done what you need to do. You had crossed your T's and dotted your I's. And you weren't also going to fall for BS. You weren't going to call everything child abuse that somebody calls in. You were going to make sure that you were being fair and being objective, that the cases that need intervention are the ones that we intervene on. We weren't being used for somebody else's, try to get a leg up in a custody battle or something like that. So anything else you want to add on what we've discussed here today before we wrap up?
From watching these videos and learning and diving in, like you said, I'm not anti Scientology or anything, but the one thing that comes to mind is that the child is never being put first, or their safety. And everything that was shown, there's never been the child first. And I'm not a parent, but if you ask any parent or anybody that is with children, the innocent of child, we put the child's safety first above your own. And that's what I'm not seeing in any of this content.
That's an excellent, excellent point, Heather. And I really appreciate your insight. So thank you for doing this with me today. I appreciate it. So we've been going for a little while. Your dogs probably need to go out. Mine's about to go out.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. All right. Bye, everybody.
Okay, you guys, I am going to quickly stop that before it starts something else.
I saved 7.
We don't want to watch that whatsoever. I'm going to take that off the screen. I will link what they were talking about, the bull baiting videos with Aaron and Serge down below. I'm going to link their contact information, or at least CarrieJ and PA's contact information. If you have any questions and want to put them on this video, I will get them to Carrie. I will get them to where they need to go so that way you can get some answers. So thank you for joining me. Have a wonderful night.